Big Shaq was minding his own business when an arrogant CEO smirked and sneered, "Stick to scrubbing floors where you belong." The entire office went dead silent. Whispers spread. Eyes darted between them. Everyone expected Shaq to get angry, but instead he smiled. Because what happened next would leave the CEO humiliated, jobless, and begging for mercy. Stay till the end, because this story, it's about to get legendary. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Daniel Carter moved the mop across the polished marble floor, his reflection shimmering beneath the fluorescent office lights. He had been working in this building for over 15 years, yet most employees passed him like he was invisible. He didn't mind. He knew the value of hard work. He knew his worth. But today someone decided to remind him of where he stood, or rather, where they thought he stood. The heavy glass doors of the corporate office swung open, and in strutted Richard Stone, the CEO of the company, dressed in an expensive navy blue suit that probably cost more than Daniel made in a month. He wasn't alone. A small group of executives trailed behind him, nodding at every word he spoke into his Bluetooth headset. His voice, loud and filled with self-importance, echoed through the lobby. Mid-conversation, Richard caught sight of Daniel. He stopped in his tracks, lowering his phone slightly as a smirk crept onto his face. "Well, well," Richard mused, eyes flicking from the mop to Daniel's face. "Look who's still here, after all these years." Daniel didn't respond, just kept moving the mop steadily across the floor. Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "You've been working here, what, 15 years now? And you're still cleaning floors?" A few executives exchanged awkward glances. A couple of younger employees standing nearby snickered, but most people just looked down, pretending they hadn't heard anything. Daniel paused, squeezing the mop handle slightly. He took a deep breath before turning to Richard, his face calm, unreadable. "Somebody has to keep this place clean." Richard grinned, clearly enjoying himself. "I mean, really, man, 15 years in the same job? No promotions? No ambition?" He shook his head in mock disappointment. "Imagine working here for so long and still being at the bottom." Silence settled over the room. Even those who laughed earlier now seemed uncomfortable. Daniel held Richard's gaze, not a flicker of anger crossing his face. Instead, a small, knowing smile played in his lips. "Imagine," Daniel said slowly, his voice steady, "thinking you know everything, and being dead wrong." Richard's smirk faltered for just a second. The tension in the room was thick. A few employees shifted uncomfortably. Richard narrowed his eyes, but Daniel simply picked up his mop and continued cleaning, as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. Richard just didn't know it yet. Richard's laughter filled the spacious, high-ceilinged lobby, its echo bouncing off the polished marble floors and glass-paneled walls. It was the kind of laugh that wasn't meant to be shared but rather to be heard, a performance meant to assert dominance. Employees who had been walking past instinctively slowed their pace. Their curiosity piqued. Some exchanged quick, nervous glances, sensing that something was unfolding, but no one dared to intervene. The energy in the room shifted, the casual workplace chatter dying down as people discreetly tuned in. Richard took his time, letting the moment stretch. He wanted Daniel to feel small, insignificant, buried under the weight of his words. He adjusted the cufflinks on his designer suit, his expression one of exaggerated amusement. "You know, maybe if you worked just a little bit harder," he said, dragging out each word for emphasis, "you wouldn't be stuck scrubbing toilets for a living." His tone was light, almost casual, as if he were dispensing career advice rather than hurling an insult. A few uneasy chuckles rippled through the room, but they were forced, awkward. Some employees looked down at their phones, pretending not to hear. Others turned toward the elevators, hoping to escape the situation entirely. Yet despite their discomfort, no one spoke up. No one told Richard he had crossed a line. Daniel, still gripping the mop handle, remained motionless. His fingers curled slightly around the worn wooden pole, but his face betrayed nothing. No anger, no humiliation, no flinch of pain. He had been in this position before. He had heard remarks like these before. Life had taught him that dignity wasn't something that could be stripped away with words. It was something you had to choose to hold on to. But Richard, mistaking Daniel's silence for submission, pressed on, stepping closer, lowering his voice into something resembling a whisper, but loud enough for the gathering employees to hear. "You'll never be more than a janitor," he said, his voice laced with smug certainty. "Accept it. The tension in the air was palpable now. Even those who had laughed earlier had fallen silent, their expressions tightening with discomfort. The insult had crossed from playful workplace banter into something cruel, something dehumanizing. A few employees shifted where they stood, looking between Richard and Daniel, waiting to see if the janitor would finally break under the weight of the moment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Daniel lifted his gaze from the freshly polished floor and met Richard's eyes. There was no anger in his expression, no visible sign that the words had landed. Instead, a quiet, steady confidence flickered in his stare, an unshaken composure that made Richard hesitate, if only for a second. And then, as if he had been presented with the simplest, most harmless statement in the world, Daniel allowed the faintest of smiles to tug at the corner of his lips. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice calm, controlled, almost amused. The employees watching held their breath, sensing something beneath the surface of Daniel's response, something Richard had failed to notice. Richard let out a scoffing laugh, shaking his head dismissively. "Yeah, sure," he muttered as he turned away, signaling the end of what he assumed was just another meaningless encounter with an unimportant employee. But something about Daniel's quiet confidence unsettled him, a nagging feeling he couldn't quite place. For the first time, doubt crept into Richard's mind. He didn't realize it yet, but his world was about to change, and Daniel Carter wasn't the man he thought he was. The sleek glass doors of the corporate office swung open with a quiet whoosh, but the impact of who walked in was anything but quiet. A massive shadow stretched across the pristine marble floors, blocking out the morning light. The air in the lobby shifted. Conversation stalled. Employees who had been preoccupied with their coffee cups and emails suddenly froze, their gazes snapping toward the entrance. Shaquille O'Neal had just walked into the building. Standing at over 7 feet tall, dressed in a tailored suit that barely contained his sheer presence, Shaq carried himself with the kind of effortless authority that turned heads in any room. His expression was calm but focused, his stride measured as he approached the front desk. A hushed wave of whispers rippled through the crowd. "Is that? Wait, what's Shaq doing here? Did we have a celebrity event today?" Even the receptionist, who had seen her fair share of high-profile clients walk through those doors, straightened up in surprise, fumbling slightly with her keyboard. Richard, however, was oblivious. Still basking in his supposed victory over Daniel, he chuckled to himself, shaking his head as he prepared to walk away. But something, a shift in the room's energy, made him pause. The sound of approaching footsteps, heavy, deliberate. Richard turned, frowning at the sudden disruption. That's when he saw him. His eyes widened slightly, but only for a fraction of a second, before his usual arrogance kicked back in. "What the hell is this?" he muttered under his breath, glancing around as if expecting someone to explain. Shaq didn't acknowledge the growing attention around him. He simply reached the front desk, his deep voice rumbling through the now silent room. "I'm here for the meeting." The receptionist swallowed hard, nodding quickly as she typed something on her screen. Richard, however, took a step forward, confusion and irritation flashing across his face. He scoffed, crossing his arms. "Who the hell invited you?" The question hung in the air, thick with disbelief. Richard didn't know it yet, but he had just challenged the wrong man. Richard adjusted his expensive cufflinks, flashing a smug grin as he turned away from Shaq and back toward Daniel, who was still standing silently by his cleaning cart. The room was thick with tension, but Richard thrived in it. He loved an audience, and right now he had one. With a dramatic wave of his hand, Richard gestured toward Shaq as if unveiling a prized possession. "Now, this is what success looks like." His voice dripped with condescension. "Big name, big money, big presence. A real businessman." A few employees exchanged uncomfortable glances, sensing where this was going. Daniel, however, remained quiet, his hands resting lightly on the mop handle, his face unreadable. Shaq raised an eyebrow, watching Richard with the kind of patience that came from knowing how this would end. Richard smirked. "See? People like me? We build things. We run companies. We make things happen. People like him," he nodded toward Daniel, "just clean up after us." A faint gasp rippled through the room. A few employees stiffened in their seats. Even the receptionist, who had been pretending to type, hesitated mid-keystroke. Shaq's expression didn't change. He simply crossed his arms over his broad chest, tilting his head slightly. His towering frame made Richard look like an overconfident child in comparison. So, Shaq said slowly, his deep voice measured, success means belittling people? Richard scoffed, waving off the question. Oh, come on, don't act all self-righteous. It's the truth. Some people are just meant to be at the top. And some? Well, he turned back to Daniel with a smug chuckle. They should know their place. For a long, heavy moment, Shaq just stared at Richard, as if deciding whether or not he was even worth the breath it would take to respond. Then finally he exhaled a soft chuckle. Huh. Richard frowned. What's so funny? Shaq leaned in slightly, his presence enough to make Richard take an involuntary step back. And what exactly do you do, Richard? Richard puffed up his chest, clearly trying to reclaim his authority. I run this place, he said, his voice full of self-importance. Shaq's lips curved into a knowing smirk. Yeah, we'll see about that. The boardroom hummed with quiet murmurs as employees shuffled into their seats, some glancing between Shaq and Richard with thinly veiled curiosity, while others whispered in hushed tones, trying to make sense of the unusual situation unfolding before them. The long mahogany table gleamed under the soft glow of recessed lighting, the tension in the room thick enough to choke on. It was clear that something big was about to happen. At the head of the table, Shaq sat with an air of quiet authority, his towering frame making the leather chair beneath him seem almost comically small. His hands were clasped together, his expression unreadable, eyes scanning the room with calculated patience. He exuded a calm, steady presence, the kind that didn't need to demand attention. It commanded it effortlessly. Richard stormed in with his usual air of self-importance, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the floor as he moved toward his seat. The smug arrogance he always carried seemed slightly shaken, though he tried to mask it behind a forced smirk. His gaze locked onto Shaq, annoyance flashing in his eyes. What the hell is this? Richard demanded, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a knife. His eyes darted from face to face, searching for an explanation. Why is he sitting at this table? Shaq didn't even blink. He simply leaned back in his chair, exuding the kind of confidence that made everyone in the room sit a little straighter. Just listening, he said, his deep voice measured and calm, yet carrying a weight that made it impossible to ignore. Richard's lips curled in disdain, but there was something else creeping into his expression, uncertainty. His hands twitched at his sides before he straightened his tie in an attempt to regain his composure. His mind raced, trying to understand what was happening, why no one was explaining this bizarre situation, and why the board members weren't reacting the way they should. Finally, one of them, an older man with silver-streaked hair and a sharp gaze, cleared his throat. His voice was even, but there was something deliberate about his tone. Well, Richard, let's just say this meeting is going to be quite different from what you're used to. The words made Richard's stomach twist, but he pushed past the unease, forcing a chuckle that didn't quite reach his eyes. He straightened his shoulders, adjusting the cuffs of his suit as he plastered a condescending smirk back onto his face. All right then, he said, his voice dripping with forced confidence. Since I have the floor, why don't I show everyone how a real businessman operates? Across the table, Shaq finally leaned forward, resting his massive hands on the polished wood. His voice was smooth, almost amused, but laced with something far more dangerous, certainty. Yeah, Richard, he said, tilting his head slightly. Why don't you? The room fell into dead silence, all eyes shifting toward Richard, as a storm he never saw coming was about to hit. Richard adjusted his suit jacket and straightened his tie, exuding the overconfidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. He leaned forward, pressing his palms against the glossy surface of the boardroom table, scanning the room as if expecting admiration. You see, true leadership is about vision, he began, his voice dripping with condescension. It's about knowing how to run a company, how to control it, and most importantly, how to keep the right people in the right places. His gaze flickered briefly toward Daniel, who sat silently at the far end of the room. Richard smirked and gestured toward him. Take Daniel here, for example. Good worker, I'm sure. Loyal even. But let's be honest, some people just aren't meant for the top. There's a place for men like him, and it's certainly not in a boardroom. The statement hung in the air like a thick fog. Some employees shifted uncomfortably, their expressions betraying their unease. Others exchanged wary glances, unwilling to challenge their CEO but clearly aware of the tension he was creating. At the head of the table, Shaq remained silent, his large hands resting casually on the armrests of his chair. He didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't even blink. Instead, he let Richard keep talking, let him dig his own grave deeper. Richard took a sip of water and continued, his arrogance now in full swing. A company thrives when people know their roles. Leaders lead, workers work. That's the way it's always been, and that's the way it should stay. He chuckled, shaking his head. People like me make things happen. People like him, he lazily pointed toward Daniel without even looking at him. Just clean up after us. A quiet chuckle broke the silence. Shaq. Richard's eyes snapped toward him, brows furrowing. Something funny? Shaq finally leaned forward, his deep voice smooth, controlled. You sure about that? Richard rolled his eyes, exhaling sharply. Of course I'm sure. Shaq smirked, tapping his fingers on the table. All right then, let's find out. Richard leaned back in his chair, his usual smug expression plastered across his face. The air in the boardroom was thick with tension, but if he noticed, he didn't care. To him, this was just another moment to bask in his own self-importance. Shaq, on the other hand, remained calm, his massive frame relaxed in the leather chair at the head of the table. He tapped his fingers on the polished wood, watching Richard with an amused glint in his eye. So, Shaq said finally, his deep voice cutting through the silence, you think you're the top guy here? Richard scoffed. Damn right. I built this company from the ground up. He adjusted his tie, flashing an arrogant smile. Every major decision runs through me. I'm the one who calls the shots. I'm the one who... Shaq slid a crisp folder across the table, cutting him off mid-sentence. Richard frowned as he glanced down at it. The Golden Company logo was embossed on the cover, its significance unmistakable. His fingers hovered over it for a second before he snatched it up, flipping it open with a scoff. His eyes darted across the first page, his smirk faltering. He flipped to the next page, and the next. His grip on the papers tightened, his jaw clenching as he read further. What is this? Richard's voice had lost its usual bravado, a hint of unease creeping in. Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His smirk widened. That, he said, his voice smooth, almost teasing, is my contract. He let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. Turns out, I own more of this company than you do. Richard's face paled, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the papers. No, this has to be a mistake. Richard's hands trembled as he gripped the papers tighter, his eyes scanning the documents as if rereading them would somehow change what they said. The once confident smirk on his face had completely vanished, replaced by an expression of disbelief. His chest rose and fell in short, panicked breaths as he turned his gaze toward the board members, searching for some kind of denial, some sign that this was all a bad joke. The room remained silent, all eyes on him. Then the chairman of the board, an older man with silver hair and sharp eyes, cleared his throat. His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable shift in the air. Shaquille has been the majority investor in this company for years, he confirmed. Everything you just read is accurate. Richard's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked around at the other board members, desperate for someone to object, to call this a lie, but they simply nodded in agreement. That's not possible, Richard finally stammered, his voice hollow. I run this company. I make the decisions. Shaq chuckled, leaning back in his chair as he folded his arms. Do you, though? His tone was light, almost playful, but the weight of his words made Richard's stomach churn. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like I have more say in this company than you do. Richard's face turned red, a mix of anger and humiliation burning through him. He slammed the folder shut and jabbed a finger toward Shaq. You planned this, didn't you? His voice was shaking, but he tried to sound forceful. You set me up. Shaq's grin widened. Nah, man, you did that all by yourself. He gestured around the room. All these people? They just watched you embarrass yourself. He leaned in slightly, his voice lowering just enough for Richard to hear the final blow. And the best part? You just insulted the guy who helped build this place. Richard stumbled back a step, his body suddenly feeling too heavy, too weak. His mind raced, trying to grasp some way out of this, some excuse that would undo what had just happened. But there was no way out. The truth had dropped like a bomb, and now he was standing in the wreckage. Richard's voice cracked as he whispered, No, this isn't happening. The tension in the boardroom was suffocating. Richard's face was pale, beads of sweat forming along his temple as he struggled to process the reality of what had just been revealed. The mighty CEO, the man who had spent years belittling others, now stood powerless before the very people he had once commanded. His confidence had evaporated, leaving behind a desperate, cornered man who refused to accept the inevitable. Shaq, still leaning back in his chair, let the silence drag on. He had no need to rush. He could see the panic in Richard's eyes, the way his fingers twitched against the table, as if grasping for control that no longer belonged to him. Finally, Shaq exhaled, clasping his hands together. His deep voice broke the silence with a weight that carried across the entire boardroom. "I think we need a leadership change." The words landed like a hammer. Murmurs erupted across the room, board members shifting in their seats, exchanging knowing glances. Some looked shocked, others relieved. A few had probably been waiting for this moment for years. Richard's head snapped toward the chairman, his voice laced with desperation. "You can't be serious. I built this company. I made it what it is today." The chairman simply adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. "Did you?" he asked, his tone neutral but cutting. "Because from what I've seen today, you seem more concerned with stroking your own ego than actually running this company." Richard's mouth opened, but Shaq cut him off. "Let's make this simple," Shaq said, his voice calm yet firm. "All in favor of firing Richard Stone as CEO, raise your hand." The room fell into eerie stillness. For a split second, nothing happened. Richard's chest rose and fell rapidly as he scanned the table, praying for loyalty, for someone, anyone, to take his side. Then one hand went up, then another, and another. One by one, the board members raised their hands, a silent but deafening declaration. The message was clear. Richard Stone was finished. Richard's breath hitched in his throat. His eyes darted between them, disbelief etched into every inch of his face. "No, you can't." His voice cracked as his entire world began to crumble. Shaq's lips curled into a knowing smirk. He had seen this before. The moment when a man who thought he was invincible realized that power was never truly his to keep. Richard stumbled back, his voice barely a whisper. "This isn't happening." The silence that followed the vote was deafening. Richard's face was frozen in disbelief, his once smug demeanor now shattered. His hands gripped the edges of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white, as if holding on for dear life. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. His mind refused to process what had just happened. His entire career, his empire, taken from him in mere seconds. A sudden knock at the boardroom door made him flinch. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and two uniformed security officers stepped inside. Their presence alone sent a ripple through the room, employees shifting uncomfortably in their seats. One of the officers, a tall man with a stoic expression, took a step forward. "Mr. Stone," he said, his voice firm, professional, "we need you to leave the premises immediately." Richard's head snapped toward the chairman. "You're letting them throw me out? You're really doing this?" His voice was laced with desperation now, no longer carrying the arrogance he once wielded so effortlessly. The chairman adjusted his glasses and sighed, his tone measured. "Richard, this is no longer your company. The board has spoken." Richard let out a bitter laugh, though it came out more like a strangled cough. "This is a mistake. A damn joke." He pointed a shaking finger at Shaq. "You think this guy can run my company better than me? He's just a—" Shaq raised an eyebrow, arms crossed over his chest, waiting. Richard swallowed his words, realizing too late that there was no way to spin this in his favor. The employees sitting around the table, the ones who had endured his cruelty for years, were watching with something he had never seen before. Satisfaction. The lead security officer cleared his throat. "Sir, please don't make this difficult." Richard's jaw clenched as he turned toward the door. He moved stiffly, every step like dragging weights behind him. His designer suit, once a symbol of power, now felt suffocating, his tie tightening around his throat. As he reached the threshold, Shaq's voice cut through the tension. "Not so fun when the tables turn, huh?" Richard paused for a brief second, his fists clenching at his sides. But there was nothing left to say. He stepped out into the lobby, and that's when the real humiliation hit. Dozens of employees had gathered, whispering in hushed tones. The same people he had berated, insulted, treated like they were beneath him, now watched as he was escorted out of the building like a common criminal. Some had their phones out recording the moment. Others just smiled, satisfied to see justice served. The security guards led him through the glass doors, out onto the sidewalk, where the midday sun seemed to mock his downfall. Behind him, inside the office, Shaq turned to the stunned employees and smirked. All right, now let's fix this place. The room was still buzzing from Richard's humiliating exit, but Shaq wasn't one to dwell on the past. He stood up from his chair at the head of the boardroom table, his massive frame commanding attention. The employees, still processing everything that had just happened, turned their eyes toward him. Some looked cautious, others excited, but all of them knew one thing. Change had arrived. Shaq ran a hand over his chin, letting the moment settle before speaking. All right, he said, his deep voice carrying through the room. Time to fix this company. Murmurs rippled across the boardroom. Some employees exchanged glances, unsure of what that meant. Others sat straighter in their chairs, hopeful. Then Shaq turned and pointed directly at Daniel Carter, the janitor who had endured years of humiliation from Richard Stone. And you, my man, Shaq said, a small smirk forming on his lips. You're going to help me do it. Silence. Daniel, still standing near the doorway, stiffened. He had been watching the whole thing unfold, never expecting to be a part of it. His hands tightened around the handle of his mop bucket. Me? He asked, his voice careful, almost disbelieving. Shaq nodded, stepping forward. Yeah, you. He glanced around at the employees in the room. See? Daniel here isn't just some guy who cleans up after you. He's been working in this company longer than most of you have. Knows the ins and outs of this building better than anyone. He turned back to Daniel. How long you been here? Daniel swallowed, his throat dry. 15 years. Shaq spread his arms. 15 years. That's longer than most CEOs last in corporate America. And in all that time, while Richard was running this place into the ground, I bet you saw things. How people were treated. How things really worked. Daniel nodded slowly, his mind racing. Yeah, I did. Shaq grinned. Good, 'cause I need someone who actually cares about this place. Someone who's got heart. Someone who understands hard work, not just numbers on a spreadsheet. A few employees started clapping, then more joined in. The energy in the room shifted. Shaq placed a firm hand on Daniel's shoulder. I want you working with me. You in? Daniel looked around, seeing the faces of employees who had once ignored him. Now they were watching him with respect. He exhaled, then smiled for the first time that day. I think I'd like that, he said. The room erupted into applause, but in the back of the hallway, a shadow lingered. Richard Stone, watching from a distance, his face twisted with rage. 1 month had passed since Richard Stone had been publicly humiliated and stripped of his title as CEO. In that short time, the once powerful executive had lost nearly everything: his influence, his wealth, and the respect of those who once feared him. His name had become a joke in corporate circles, a cautionary tale of arrogance leading to downfall. But no one expected what happened next. Daniel Carter stepped into a high-rise office building, now dressed sharply in a tailored suit. A far cry from the janitor's uniform he had worn for years, he carried himself with quiet confidence, walking beside Shaq, who had personally guided him into his new leadership role. As they strolled through the lobby, discussing plans for their latest project, Daniel suddenly slowed his steps, his eyes locking onto a familiar figure in the distance. A man in a dull gray janitor's uniform was hunched over a mop, scrubbing the marble floor with slow, tired movements. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion, his once expensive watch now absent from his wrist. His hair, which had always been meticulously styled, was now slightly disheveled. Richard Stone. Daniel's breath hitched slightly, but Shaq had already noticed. He smirked knowingly before taking a deliberate step forward. Well, Shaq said, his deep voice echoing slightly in the lobby. Look who's embracing a little hard work. Richard froze at the sound of that voice. His grip on the mop tightened as he slowly turned around. When he saw Shaq and Daniel standing before him, one a man he had foolishly disrespected, the other the very person he had mocked, his face turned pale. Daniel tilted his head slightly, crossing his arms. Didn't expect to see you here, Richard. Richard's lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but no words came. His eyes flickered with something rare. Humility. Defeat. He swallowed hard, staring down at the floor as if searching for an escape. Shaq chuckled, taking a step closer. You know, I believe in karma, he said, his tone light but firm. And man, this is some poetic justice. Richard finally found, his voice, though it was quieter, almost strained. Look, Shaq held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. No need to explain. he said with a grin. Just make sure you don't miss a spot. Daniel smirked, shaking his head as Shaq patted his back, and together they walked off, leaving Richard standing there, gripping the mop as he watched them disappear into the executive offices, where he once belonged but never would again.